In the last presentation, we discussed how argument is for equals, that those who are in a position to command should not argue with those who are in a position to receive commands or to obey. To do otherwise is to necessarily interrupt and to rearrange that relationship. So if a parent, for example, argues with a child, what that parent is doing is stepping down from being in a position to command the child to one who is in a position to have to gain belief from the child and cooperation and acceptance, as though they're in a position to pass judgment on the statements that the parent is making them. And so when parents argue with children, they become no longer really parents and children, they become equals. And this is what is as I say, disruptive of that relationship, and some would even say disordered. So now there's another way in which we realize inequality through people, and that is even when people are equals in terms of their social roles, there's something that creates inequality, and that is that when we have stronger personalities that are in the room with weaker personalities, this creates a dominance relationship. Stronger personalities, unless they have other rules or norms to follow, they will take over the room, and we know how that can work. Now, on the other hand, weaker personalities, if they also do not have the outside and transcendent norms working on them and on the stronger personalities, they help cooperate and they sustain a dominance relationship when the dominance relationship shouldn't exist. When equals are arguing with one another, they should remain that. They should remain equals. And so what we need to have are norms which transcend both parties, both personalities, and therefore maintain that equality. Now let's take a look at this chart, and you've got an equal, a superior, and an inferior. And the speech act that is proper to each, what favorable response is sought after when that speech act is made, what unfavorable response is sometimes received, how we reply to that unfavorable response, and then what happens if there's no challenge or there's an end of the challenge. Now, equals, as we've already established, argue, superiors command, inferiors entreat. So those are the speech acts, and so we're just building on what we saw in the previous presentation. What we seek when we argue with somebody is their agreement. That's what we're seeking. We're seeking their agreement, and sometimes that takes the form of cooperation. A superior is seeking obedience or compliance. That's the only thing that is sought when a superior makes a command, is for the other person to obey. The inferior, because it is their part to make entreaties or requests, what they're looking for is some kind of accession to their request, the granting of the request. But they know in making the request that the person they are making the request to is in a position to grant or to deny the request. Now, the unfavorable response sometimes we receive as equals, we get disagreement. And this very commonly happens. We all don't need to really belabor the point. When superiors, they receive the unfavorable response, we know this is rebellion or disobedience. And then the inferior receives denial or refusal of their request. Now, what happens then when you want to reply to that unfavorable response is an equal will offer sometimes counter-argument and refutation of the statements they've just heard. So in order to continue to seek the agreement they want, they will continue to bring out further arguments against the things they've just heard by way of disagreement. A superior may respond with discipline or punishment when they are met with rebellion or disobedience. An inferior, when they don't get what they want, sometimes may appeal to a higher authority. This is, of course, instituted in many different places, including our judicial system. Now, what happens when there's no challenge or there's an end of the interaction? Perhaps what we get is persuasion. Perhaps one party has won the other party over. One equal has won the agreement of the other, in which case, as we've already said, an equal really doesn't submit to the equal, but to the reason that they've been shown. Sometimes we get an agreement to disagree. People decide we aren't going to get anywhere let's just agree right now that we will not convince the other. A superior, if there's no challenge, there will be, after following the discipline or punishment, there will be obedience to the compliance that was originally sought. So we see that the end goal of all discipline and punishment was to get the original thing of obedience and compliance. The inferior, if they stop with their challenge, or there's the end of the interaction, they may simply accept the decision and move on. Now, as we've already said, and I don't think we can emphasize too strongly, argumentation cannot take place without equality among the participants. Now, in order to make sure that this equality obtains, as we've already said, sometimes personalities get out of hand. What we need instead are outside norms that will effectively bring those people who may be naturally inclined to dominance or to subservience, and then to shape them in such a way that they will participate as equals. And what these outside norms do, they exist to protect the activity of argument. They exist to ensure that argument is what it's supposed to be, and that is that people meet each other as equals, seeking to persuade each other. How do we do that? Well, the personalities have to give way to certain virtues, which will ensure that those norms protecting equality are observed. So the rules that we have for having an argument, for example, the perhaps most obvious is taking turns. We allow one person to speak, and the other person is allowed to speak after that. And when it's not your turn to speak, what you are supposed to be doing is listening closely. Another norm that we're supposed to follow is that when we respond to the statements we have heard, we are supposed to respond to the statements that were made and not to something else. So we're not to ascribe to the person we're arguing with a view that they have not espoused. That's called attacking a straw man. It's one of the fallacies that we'll consider later on. But let's discuss now these virtues and how they work to help protect the activity of argument. Let's subordinate the personality to a higher purpose. First of all, let's remember what it is that we're doing. We are having an argument. We have to meet each other as equals in order to do that. So we have to agree to subordinate ourselves to those norms and to the purpose that we're out to achieve. So let's look at, we have a chart here, a definition, an example of 4 main types of virtues. These are called the 4 classical virtues. They are prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And I'll give you a brief rundown of each in an example. Prudence is just practical wisdom, and that's basically knowing when we're supposed to act, when not to act, and in what way. So an example of this would be, say you're at a get-together of different people, and one person makes a gaffe, and depending on how bad that gaffe is, you may need to issue some correction. And depending on, again, how obvious and how bad that is, you may or may not need to correct that person in front of the group, where the entire group would benefit from the correction if it's bad enough, or if it's not such a big deal, maybe waiting until after the get-together is over, or until you can have a moment of private interaction with the person, so to save them some embarrassment. That takes practical wisdom, and sometimes we will simply get it wrong if we're inexperienced, but with time, with experience, we will learn when's the right time to issue corrections and when's the wrong time. Justice, this is being inclined to give others what they have coming to them, what they deserve, what is due to them. And so the example of taking turns, that is a perfect example of justice when we are arguing. Now we know that dominant personalities tend to not respect this. They tend to not allow a person with a weaker personality to have their full say. They will butt in, they will interject, they will try to dominate the conversation, but simple justice dictates that they refrain from doing that until the other person has spoken. On the other hand, the person who is a weaker party, if they are interrupted, if they have the virtue of justice, they may be moved to insist on their turn to speak. And we've already also talked about summarizing what another person says fairly. We all have the right to be responded to for what we have said, not for what we haven't. Temperance, this is self-restraint. This is the ability to, while we have an impulse, not to give in to it, but to respect the activity that's going on, and that takes a certain amount of self-control. So for example, if you have an urge to interrupt somebody when they've made a statement that you really don't like to hear, or if you know a lot about a subject and you don't show off everything, you're showing some kind of self-restraint or temperance, and it's a great thing to exhibit. Fortitude, this is meeting dangers or threats, and at the right amount of time and in the right way. So, for example, if you utter an unpopular statement, that you're fully prepared to be subject to any kind of vigorous challenge, especially when the subject is very controversial, and especially when one is in a minority and social status and other things may be at stake. But if one is persuaded that one has reason on one side more than the other, the fortitude would dictate to make the statement anyway and be prepared to give an answer. This is kind of the scary part of argument, and sometimes I wonder if this is why a lot of people don't take debate a lot, because not only do they have to utter sometimes controversial statements, but they have to do so and be ready to be challenged at a moment's notice, and they have to be quick on their feet. And it's a scary proposition. It's commonly noted that one of the greatest fears is to speak publicly. I've even heard that speaking publicly is more greatly feared than is dying, because at least everyone has to die, but not everyone has to speak in public, and why not avoid it if you can? So altogether, here we are looking at our virtues and examples of each, and you see how these virtues can mold and shape the person, and so refine the personalities, and thereby ensuring that we all meet each other as equals. And this goes on both sides. A weaker personality who doesn't insist on their turn to speak when they're interrupted fails in justice. They fail to be just, in a sense, to themselves, because they too have a right to speak. So we can see now how equality can be easily disrupted by personality, but virtue and the outside norms that virtue will help us to live and operate by can ensure that argument does flow well in its proper social context among equals.